Good afternoon. I'm really happy to see everyone here today. I'm Janet Cox, and I lead Climate Action California, which is sponsoring this webinar with a number of our allied groups. And it's wonderful to be talking about this important subject at this time. I am going to introduce Stephen Feit, an old friend with the Center for International Environmental Law, who has done a lot of really important work on lots of topics that we're interested in. But what he'll be talking about today is the intersection between fossil fuel companies and the agricultural chemical companies and the problems that this cabal is causing for biodiversity, the planet, environmental justice. I mean, it's a lot. We are in the midst of the year when the Congress has to reauthorize the Farm Bill, which is arguably the biggest climate package happening in Washington, D.C. in 2023. And we're all pretty much focused on agriculture and its tremendous contributions to climate change right now. So Stephen is the senior attorney and the legal and research manager for the Center for International Environmental Law. And he has, it's my impression that he's kind of grown this role to fit his vast array of strategic interests in climate change and the work that we all need to do to get a handle on this. And I know you're going to love hearing this today. So I'm just going to get out of the way. And I will be trying to figure out how many questions we can take at the end of this. So put your questions in the chat, and it's great to see everybody here. Over to Stephen.
Thanks so much, Janet. And thanks to all of you who are here taking the time to listen to me today and to invite me into your virtual space. I'm going to screen share in just a second, but first, maybe I'll just continue introducing myself. As Janet said, I'm Stephen Feit, the Senior Attorney and Legal and Research Manager on the Fossil Economy team at the Center for International Environmental Law, based out of Washington, D.C. So CIEL has been around since 1989, and we use the power of the law to protect the environment, promote human rights, and ensure a just and sustainable society. And so today, I want to talk to you about fossils, fertilizers, and false solutions. How laundering fossil fuels and agrochemicals puts the climate and the planet at risk. So, can you all see my screen?
Yep.
Excellent. So,
Stephen, your connection is not perfect.
Oh.
We're getting a little bit of a delay and a little bit of an auto tune.
It helps
Okay.
if you kill your video, Stephen.
Okay, yeah, I can turn my video off. Is that better? Are you hearing me more crisply?
Sounds okay. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, please let me know if I conk out or anything while I'm presenting. But so by way of background and sort of where we come to this, I come to this work from the fossil fuel side, and primarily or originally from a climate perspective, but really we're talking about the exceedance of multiple planetary boundaries, climate being just one of them. There are also huge issues with nitrogen and phosphorus, land use change, biodiversity loss, and plastic and synthetic chemical pollution in the environment. And the agrochemicals industry and industrial agriculture really sit at the heart of several of these, the exceedances of these planetary boundaries. And in particular, pesticides and nitrogen-based fertilizers, which are fossil fuels in another form, and we'll cover that in a sec, are driving these exceedances. And as you can see in this chart on the bottom, the use of agrochemicals has been on a pretty steady increase for the past 60 or so years. And so against this backdrop, we released this report, Fossils, Fertilizers, and False Solutions, which really exposes how the fossil fertilizer industry is advancing a new business model that will both extend the fossil economy and entrench industrial agriculture in the midst of the climate emergency. And so this presentation is going to proceed in two parts, mirroring the structure of the report itself. And so the first part will really talk about the agriculture system, and the second will really bring in the fossil fuel and energy components. So first, establishing agrochemicals as a new front in the fight against the fossil economy. What is the industrial agriculture system? What is this thing that we're talking about? One definition we use is that it is a large-scale, intensive method of food production dominated by large corporations that is geared towards high yields and involves the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. And this method of production requires, amongst other things, monocultures, pesticides, and fertilizers. The idea of monocultures enables the industrial commodity model of farming, but they require pesticides and fertilizers as synthetic and chemical inputs to keep production going, right? The monocultures are vulnerable to pests and to blights and require pesticides. The pesticides and the monocultures destroy the soil quality, requiring fertilizers, and the cycle continues. So we need to think about all of these things as interconnected and part of the same system. So starting with pesticides, I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about pesticides, but I do want to address them, that, pesticides really are among the most toxic substances on the planet. They inflict widespread damage to ecosystems and to human health. These include things like herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. They also present themselves a direct and an indirect climate impact. The Pesticide Action Network recently released a report that talks about the impact of pesticides on climate that I'd recommend checking out. And like other synthetic chemicals, they are primarily fossil-based. Recently, we actually released a report essentially detailing how the European Union in particular is exporting pesticides that are banned in the EU, but are exporting them to Africa and Central America, really detailing the damage that these materials and these chemicals can do. So the other part of the agrochemical equation are synthetic fertilizers. And there's a number of different kinds of fertilizers. The main ones are phosphorus, potassium, and nitrogen, which are the main nutrients that plants need to grow. Phosphorus and potassium are mined. They're still synthetic, but they're not coming out of the natural kind of cycle, but they're not fossil-based. They are mineral-based. Nitrogen fertilizer, which represents more than half of all synthetic fertilizer, is produced almost exclusively from fossil fuels. So when I'm talking about fossil fertilizers, what I'm really talking about are synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. And so fossil fertilizers themselves have really dire direct impacts. They poison waterways, they create these algal blooms, they degrade and pollute the soil, increasing salinity and acidification. They produce air pollution as the nitrogen in the fertilizer volatilizes and becomes ammonia, and they increase the use of microplastics in agricultural soils. We also recently released a report called Sowing a Plastic Planet, talking about how increasingly fertilizer companies are wrapping their fertilizer in microplastic coatings as a way to create sort of extended release fertilizers. And so there's deliberate introduction of sorry. So there's, am I muted or can you hear me?
We can hear you. I'm sorry. I was muting other people because we were getting background noise and I muted you by mistake. Sorry.
Got it. All good. But yeah, so we're seeing the deliberate introduction of microplastics into the agricultural system and into agricultural soils, which of course are what the food we eat grows in. So what actually are synthetic fertilizers? And we're going to go through this image on the left, sort of step by step in a second, but they are fossil fuels in another form. And these fossil fertilizers are an under-recognized but significant driver of the climate crisis. So going step by step, to create fertilizer from fossil fuels, first you have to create hydrogen. You can do that from either starting from methane, fossil gas, or from coal. Either way, what you're doing is you're taking steam and blasting fossil fuels with it. And so you break the water, which is H2O, you break the hydrogens off the water, you break the hydrogens off of the fossil fuels, and you're left with hydrogen molecules and carbon dioxide. And so this itself is an enormously emissions intense activity, creating huge amounts of carbon dioxide to then get that hydrogen. Something like, I forget the exact figure, but 75 or 80% of hydrogen is produced from methane, from fossil gas. The rest is pretty much produced from coal. In the United States, it's almost exclusively from gas. Once you have hydrogen, you need to create ammonia. So you take the nitrogen that already exists in air, separate it out, and using a lot of heat and pressure, you just smush the hydrogen and the nitrogen together and you get ammonia, which is a NH3, is an ammonia molecule. That ammonia can then be combined with carbon dioxide, which is captured from step one, to create urea. And urea is a solid, stable molecule, and that is the form that about 80% of nitrogen fertilizer takes. So starting from fossil fuels and steam and inputting a lot of energy, you get this urea molecule and water. When you put all this together, the climate impacts of fertilizers are really immense. A recent study looking at the total emissions from both production and application found that the contribution of fertilizer to global emissions is about 2.5%. That 1 out of every 40 tons of greenhouse gas emissions, or CO2 equivalents, is coming from just fossil fertilizers. And this is because fertilizer is extremely emissions intensive in both the production and the application phase. So about 40% of emissions just come from industrial production. That's the 2 bars on the left, manufacturing and transport. But about 60% come from the use. So that CO2 that they captured in step 1 and put back into the urea molecule in step 3, that gets re-released from decomposition when fertilizer is applied to soils. That's that 3rd bar, releasing about 86 million tons of CO2 per year. But then the nitrogen itself, it can volatilize into ammonia. It can also turn into N2O, nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas 276 times stronger than carbon dioxide. And so even small amounts of nitrous oxide can have really, really deleterious climate impacts. And so you get both direct emissions from fertilizer application and indirect emissions from the nitrogen that's lost to the atmosphere, lost to waterways, that ultimately then gets oxidized into N2O. So when you put this together, you see this is not just a production issue and not just an application issue, but really it's an issue all the way across the life cycle, producing huge, huge amounts of greenhouse gases. And again, this is just the fertilizer part. It's not any of the other emissions from the industrial agriculture system. it's worth flagging that fertilizer is a growth engine for fossil gas. It represents the greatest growth sector amongst feedstock uses. So for non-energy uses of gas, like plastics, it is a petrochemical, and it is one of the growth strategies of the fossil fuel industry for the 21st century. And then finally, I want to talk about this agrochemicals in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where we saw huge spikes in the price of gas, and therefore a spike in the price of fertilizer and food. And I just want to talk about this quote from Michael Fakhri, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, in response to a statement from a number of international institutions, where he said, the fundamental problem is not farmers' access to chemical fertilizers has been disrupted. It's that so many farmers rely heavily on chemical fertilizers in the first place. In the immediate term, it is important to make sure fertilizers reach farms whose farming system depends on them, but the ultimate goal must be to wean them off this dependency as soon as possible. And that tying our food production system to the fossil system puts it on the roller coaster of oil and gas prices and creates fundamental instability. So wrapping up part one, the global industrial food system is pushing the exceedance of several planetary boundaries. Fossil fuels are critical inputs to the fertilizers and pesticides that sustain and drive that system. In addition to threatening health, ecosystems, and biodiversity, fossil fertilizers are also an under-recognized threat to the climate, and the role of fossil inputs into the industrial agriculture system makes food systems vulnerable to price shocks and disruptions. So part two, laundered emissions. How fertilizer companies are pushing blue hydrogen and blue ammonia as false climate solutions. So pivoting to the energy side of this, we need to talk about carbon capture and storage and hydrogen as fossil fuel enablers. So the fossil fuel sector promotes carbon capture, hydrogen, and ammonia as these core pillars of an energy transition that entrenches and increases fossil fuel use. The idea is that the energy from fossil fuels are being packaged without the CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion. This is the promise of this carbon management hydrogen paradigm. And I want to flag right off the bat that these are the techniques that are already fundamental to fertilizer production. Just walking back a bit, carbon capture is not new. Standard Oil had patents for the production of carbon dioxide from waste streams back in the 50s. Imperial Oil, an Exxon subsidiary in Canada, was aware and sort of actively evaluating carbon capture in the late 70s and early 80s, noting that it's possible, but not super effective and very, very expensive. Most carbon capture to date has been in the service of big oil. Nearly 70% is processing natural gas, and more than 70% has been used for enhanced oil recovery to actually extract more oil from spent wells. And critically, this is not incidental or an accident. If we look at the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative, which is now the Carbon Capture Coalition, that the main barrier to taking advantage of enhanced oil recovery's potential is the insufficient supply of affordable CO2. That a lot of enhanced oil recovery is done with naturally occurring carbon dioxide deposits, but those are limited and not necessarily conveniently located. So a huge part of the push for carbon capture is not just under the guise of climate action, but it's actually in service of oil production itself. So does carbon capture work? A fantastic evaluation from the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis shows that the failures and the underperformance of these projects has outnumbered successful projects considerably. They reviewed 13 flagship projects and saw profound failures throughout. You can see this graphic on the right. The claims of potential capture rates are often far from reality, especially when you include the emissions from the power needed to run the carbon capture equipment itself. Ultimately, carbon capture looks good on paper, but bad in practice. The IPCC, which does include CCS in its models, aggressively cautions against reliance over and over throughout its reports. It includes enormously high capture rates in those models, which are unrealistic. It notes the really high costs that have not dropped over time, that it can increase the requirements for electricity generation by 13 to 44%. And again, that this technology has not been getting cheaper and not operating on the cost curve that things like solar and batteries have. And this is why they note that carbon capture is amongst the highest cost, lowest potential options for reducing emissions over the next decade, which is the crucial decade for climate action. Hydrogen is a lot of hype. There are tons of headlines, but in reality, it remains in service of fossil fuels. In service of fossil fuels. If you look at hydrogen production, you can see in 2021, 99.96% of hydrogen was made with fossil fuels. That most was with natural gas. There was some coal byproduct. That means like from oil refineries and other fossil fuel refining processes. It is overwhelmingly produced from fossil fuels. Hydrogen is also overwhelmingly used for fossil fuel or fossil fuel related activities. The main two markets are using hydrogen back in refineries to hydrogenate and desulfurize oil, as well as to produce ammonia, with a few other applications. The fossil fuel industry is the country's primary producer and consumer of hydrogen. So blue hydrogen has been getting a lot of attention. This is hydrogen with carbon capture on it, but when used for there we go. When used for energy, you can see it actually emits more greenhouse gases when you include the upstream emissions and the methane emissions from natural gas production than just burning the gas to begin with. All hydrogen has really significant limitations. It's difficult to transport, it's explosive, it produces a ton of nitrous oxide or nitrogen oxides when burning, and it's prone to leaking and is itself an indirect greenhouse gas. This is a really important point. Hydrogen, when you burn it, does not create carbon dioxide, but hydrogen, if you release it into the atmosphere, it itself is not a greenhouse gas, but it reacts with the molecules in the air that scrub methane out of the atmosphere, essentially, which means it prolongs the life of methane in the atmosphere, which has the same effect as increasing the amount of methane in the atmosphere. And so that's why it's referred to as an indirect greenhouse gas. And this is critical because hydrogen is also the smallest molecule and extremely, extremely prone to leaking. Green hydrogen itself has additional limitations and requires huge energy and water inputs. Ammonia, which is pitched as a solution to the problems of hydrogen because it can be transported as a liquid, is extremely toxic. It's promptly lethal if one's exposed to it in high doses. It's highly, highly corrosive, limiting its potential use as a fuel, and it releases huge amounts of nitric oxides when combusted, just like hydrogen. And of course, to turn hydrogen into ammonia and then back into hydrogen again would require huge amounts of energy, making it further inefficient for a number of potential uses. So where do the fertilizer companies fit in? As we talked about, the fertilizer industry already produces hydrogen and ammonia as its core products. This is how you create fossil fertilizers, right? You produce hydrogen, then ammonia, then urea. And this industry is expanding rapidly. There are at least 19 projects in the United States at various stages in the supply chain that are planned or announced just in the United States. Yeah, they're operating or actively exploring dozens of new or expanded facilities in at least 9 countries and at least 8 US states. Internationally, there are projects in Europe, projects in Asia Pacific and the Middle East and North Africa. And critically, these connections are not just based on supply chain, but actually in terms of corporate overlap. There are extensive shared board memberships, overlapping corporate ownership structures, and agrochemical companies' direct engagement in fossil fuel production that further tethers food systems and agrochemical production to the fossil economy itself. So what is the solution? On the ag side, the linear input reliant model of industrial agriculture is in need of a profound transformation to resilient regenerative models that enhance food sovereignty while sustaining and restoring ecosystems and the communities that depend on them. So this requires urgently reducing reliance on fossil fertilizers and the pesticides and plastics with which they are increasingly coupled. Thank you. Oh, Janet, you're muted.
Sorry. I want to thank you and just say that you touched on so many of the issues that Climate Action California is working on every day. This is why we all have so much to do. And it's critically important that we do it fast. So this is really helpful. Let's take some questions. I see Nora has her hand up. Everybody else, please.
Yeah, thank you.
And
So Stephen, thank you so much for that presentation. It was very sobering and helpful. But the federal government seems to have bought into all this hype about CCS and hydrogen production and has poured tons of money into it. And do you have any suggestions for cutting back that funding, or do we have allies in Congress who would be willing to introduce bills to cut off some of that subsidies for these boondoggle projects? Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is true that at present there's, if not consensus, at least bipartisanship around carbon capture and hydrogen, and particularly with the Inflation Reduction Act, huge increases in the subsidies for carbon capture. I think without going into sort of specific legislators, I think the key is actually sharing, pointing out all of the flaws in the carbon capture paradigm that get papered over in conversations about it. I think a key example of this is when you look at capture rates, there was an effort in the Inflation Reduction Act or the Build Back Better Act, one of the earlier drafts, to have a requirement for capture. And a group of carbon capture proponents essentially wrote a letter saying, if we have to capture that much CO2, we won't be able to, and we won't be able to get the tax credits, right? And I think a lot of people simply don't know that this is old technology that is not unproven, but has been proven to fail. And secondly, people don't know about the actual on-the-ground impacts that these facilities have. It's sort of pitched as this, off-the-shelf equipment that you just tack onto a smokestack and call it a day. But the process is essentially constructing a whole new chemicals facility and power plant next to whatever it is you want to attach the carbon capture to. And when you look at the increase in pollution and ammonia at the site, and the huge build out of pipelines that would be required, and the requirement for injection sites and all of those things, I think people don't understand we're talking about a huge industrial operation that requires building a whole layer of infrastructure on top of what we already have in place. And the environmental justice impacts of that and the public health impacts of that are not widely known. And I think talking about that more is how we shift the conversation.
Are you, would you be willing to share your slides for us to like take to our legislators?
Oh, yeah, most definitely.
Thank you.
That would be great. We've had a couple of requests for slides. Carol Miller has a question. She says, I'm going to figure out how to unmute you. How do I do that? Oh my gosh.
I muted myself. This might
good.
sound really naive. I don't know. I'm wondering, like, are we able to feed everybody without the use of these things? Has our population gotten to the point and are having converted open space to, you know, buildings to the point where we have to be somewhat reliant on synthetic fertilizers? So that was my question. Like, can we really do it with regenerative practices?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's usually the first one I get, or you know, that comes up in these conversations. So thank you for bringing it up. There's a few. I want to maybe provide 3 answers. The first is, you cannot just take the industrial system as we have it and take away the agrochemicals and just stop there, right? That won't work. We need to transition the crop production that we have to models that are more diversified, that are regenerative, that require different modes of operation. There have been, I mean, there are models of regenerative agriculture, agroecology. I mean, there's different words to describe it. I mean, even things like agroforestry that have demonstrated, you know, either near or equivalent or better yields than the industrial agriculture model. The difference is that it doesn't look like one thing. The thing that industrial agriculture does is take any situation, as long as the land is flat, and turn it into the same kind of basically plant factory. But if we want to have a regenerative system, it will necessarily be place-based. So there's not a single answer to what we're transitioning to. Having said that, in the near term, there's a lot of room to simply reduce overuse and reduce waste. When we look at 40%, I think, of the US corn crop, which is just turned into ethanol for internal combustion engines, which we're intending to phase out anyway, you know, a huge amount of land gets freed, a huge amount of sort of pressure on the system gets relieved. When we look at food waste, when we look both in terms of crops that are grown and not eaten, but also organic material that is sent to landfills as opposed to recirculated back into the system and then themselves serving as fertilizers, because there need to be fertilizers. There don't need to be synthetic, you know, linear input fertilizers, right? And then of course there's the role of livestock production and just the amount of food that's grown to feed to animals that if we're fed directly to people would be, you know, an order of magnitude more available calories. So there's a lot of answers that operate on different timescales. So again, there's not a single silver bullet solution, but the short answer is, I mean, yes, this is doable. It just requires not just, you know, political will in the abstract sense, but, you know, regulatory structures and financial supports, because transitioning a farm from its, you know, a current linear model to a regenerative one takes time to just rebuild the soil and put the systems in place.
Dave Shukla has a question about arches. Can you ask your question, Dave?
Well, thank you, Janet. That was more of an aside. Earlier, when you started mentioning the hydrogen and CCS projects and generally what was wrong with them, I mean, I think you've already covered that, these are getting a lot of they're crowding out investments in renewables. These are getting a lot of the monies that we could be getting otherwise. I would like to know, just to follow up on what you already laid out, Stephen, how do activist groups like some of those of us on the call engage with some of the demonstration projects and actually, like one of the other questions in the chat, go to decision makers like CARB, explain to them what our findings are?
That's a great question, and I mean, I think there's probably more expertise on that kind of those efforts on this call amongst the people on this call than I have. I mean, I think what I have found to be successful is forcing the conversation past the superficial phase, right? That oftentimes the conversations around CCS and hydrogen get kind of yada yada, that when you really scrutinize them and you say, okay, well, how much of a percentage of emissions are being targeted here, and what is the expectation on the capture rate, and where is it going to go, and what communities is it going through, and who's paying for it, and who's on the hook if it doesn't work, and kind of ask all these questions, the reality of those projects and sort of who benefits, who bears the cost, and who bears the risk becomes really clear. But because this is sold as a new technology and innovative and cutting edge, people aren't aware to ask those questions. I mean, there's certainly some bad actors and cynical folks, but for those who are truly interested and believe that it is, a genuine climate solution, I think there's a lot of room to move on simply pointing to the facts on the ground.
And we have had a number of meetings with CARB board members and staff on lots of issues. We seem to be able to get in the door with some substantive questions, and we will continue to do that. And I always feel like it's just a gift to be working on these issues in California, because California is so huge and influential. If we can move California a little bit, we can move the nation to some extent, which isn't to say we're not also talking with our Congress people, which we are, including today. But Christina from Center for Biological Diversity, you've had your hand up for a while. Please ask your question.
So much. I kept putting it up and taking it down because I don't know if this is probably a better question just to email you afterwards. Stephen, it's great to meet you, and thank you for this presentation. And one of the things that you just alluded to is my favorite thing about this presentation is how you are tying it all together. So your name actually has come up, unsurprisingly, in current debates in the California Assembly. I wonder if you've been contacted. And if not, may I present them your presentation today to reach out to you. And there is at least one Assembly member and the Assembly Natural Resources, again, I'm talking California, not federal, apologize.
Right.
Debating hydrogen. And this Assembly member has mentioned that he honestly doesn't know that much about CCS and needs to learn more, but he sees them as compartmentalized issues, right? And the debate is occurring. There have been one meeting, the second meeting is coming up sometime next month, the date's not been set, which is going to be set up as a debate. The first meeting was a presentation of positions from EJ groups, enviros, and the industry. And of course, all the standard industry arguments were there. And your name has come up as potential speakers and presentations for the second event. So maybe we can talk offline about it. I don't know. I don't want to step on toes if you've already been spoken to about it, but I think this is sort of the connection that really needs to be had. It needs to be wrapped into, you know, it's not just about the fertilizers. It's not just about CCS. It's not just about energy, right? I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, first, that's flattering. I haven't heard anything, but that's exciting to hear, that debate is happening in the assembly and in the legislature. I mean, I think, yeah, one of the things that makes this so difficult is a lot of things look good if you just look at the really narrow slice, right? And so hydrogen is a great example where, yeah, when you burn hydrogen, it doesn't produce carbon dioxide, and that looks really good. And it's just when you look up and downstream from that that you see it's potentially either not that much of an improvement or worse than doing nothing, depending on the particularities of what system you're putting together. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of directions to take that conversation, but we should absolutely connect on that. I also, yeah, let's talk about that offline for sure.
Will do. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'd also love to be in that conversation, Christina, so we should definitely talk, because we have a lot of expert people who are all over hydrogen also. So there are some other questions in the chat. So Annie Phillips asks how we should lobby about the Farm Bill, and what would you like to see there? Have you thought specifically about the Farm Bill, Stephen, or the various parts of this gigantical document where we might make a difference? And I can also say to Annie that we're talking to congressmen frequently about the Farm Bill, and I'd be happy to clue you into some of those conversations. But so, Stephen, what are you getting down to that granular level with the Farm Bill?
Not, I'm because I come to it from the fossil side and not the ag side. I'm not deep in the Farm Bill.
Okay. Well,
and I mean, as we talked about, I think it was just 2 days ago, we haven't even seen the text of it.
well, we still haven't. I mean, it's
yeah,
in process. But
yeah, I mean,
if folks
would
on the
say-
call are interested in working with us on Farm Bill issues, put your name in the chat and I will be back in touch. And we'll keep talking about this because it is a huge big deal right now.
yeah.
So Beverly Deschaux has some comments from she had a meeting at CARB where she testified at CARB recently, and it sounds a little discouraging. And then she also has a comment about how fast the transition might happen if there was the political will. So Beverly, do you want to talk for a second? If she's still here, wait a minute.
Yes, I am still here.
Oh, good. Please.
It's very frustrating on all levels. We now have people who are considered to be environmentalists in our local government, which is in Santa Cruz, California, and they're promoting hydrogen, and our metro just ordered 23 hydrogen buses. I'm about to have a meeting with the executive director, but I don't know if it's retrievable. Yeah, the meeting with CARB was very disappointing. And as I said in my message, the people from the hydrogen industry are coming to the meetings and demanding as much money as has been put out for EVs. And they're very vocal, and they are making up stuff. And they have all these generalizations that they present. Well, like as I said in the thing, they're all based on supposition. They're not real facts. And since when you're in a meeting, you can only say something once, and that's it. You can't debate, and then people will come in after me. I've actually had in our local CCA, our advisory board has on its as one of its members the executive director of the ag industry in our region in the Salinas Valley, and he has flat out called me a liar in public meetings. Anyway, so it's a huge battle, and it's very frustrating. And I'm glad to know that other people, and thank you, Stephen, so much for your work. This is tremendous, tremendous. But I've also heard that other people who have gone to CARB, who are experts as well, are just brushed aside. They're not listened to. So my concern is that even if we presented what you have presented here to us, that's what would happen. That the co-chair of CARB has said that she is firmly committed to hydrogen. So I don't know. And as was the previous chair, committed to hydrogen.
Well, it just is, but in here for a minute, we've done a lot of work on legislation regarding hydrogen in the California legislature. There are a couple of senators who seem to be kind of bought and paid for by the hydrogen lobby, but I think that, we've been arguing consistently for a couple of years that hydrogen has specific appropriate uses and needs to be manufactured in truly green ways, which means using electricity generated from a dedicated renewable source. And we'll just continue to work on hydrogen. Some of these bills have been amended as they've moved through the legislature and gotten a little bit better, but we are coming up on some final votes on a couple of Senate bills in the Assembly. And we're going to have to make it very clear to everyone before those votes happen, probably at after Labor Day and before the end of the session on the 14th of September, that we really have to, if we're really concerned about the climate, we have to limit the use of hydrogen really specifically. So yeah.
I'm with the Electric Vehicle Association on the Central Coast, but I also am in relationship with the Silicon Valley chapter of the organization, and many of our members are engineers. I mean, they work for Google, they work for Tesla, they know. And what they say is that to take the energy to produce hydrogen and then turn it back into electric is using 2 to 4 times the amount of energy. And they keep saying green hydrogen or blue hydrogen. And they've been saying that, according to our engineers, for over 50 years. It's not happened. Also, the filling stations, if you were to put it in a vehicle, the filling stations cost $1.9 to $4 million each.
Right. Yeah.
I mean,
so Beverly, you and I should talk offline, or maybe you should in our energy group, because we are all over this, and these are the points that we're making too. So
I would love it.
I'll sign you up. And somebody from Californians Against Waste has their hand up. Who are you?
Hi, this is Nicole Currian from California Against Waste.
Great.
I just wanted to add to the conversation that we're aware, I believe the bill that you were talking about in the California legislature was AB 1550 by Assemblymember Bennett, was that correct?
That's one of them. There are others also. Yeah.
We'd love to be involved in that conversation as well. We've been concerned about green hydrogen, specifically because we worked on an anti-incineration bill, AB 1705 with Assemblymember McKinner, and that also covered pyrolysis and gasification. And the bill actually was pretty much killed because of a company called H-Cycle. So H-Cycle, I guess, has this technology that converts what they call like green waste, I guess, into hydrogen using gasification, which we covered specifically because it's greenwashing and environmental justice covers environmental justice issues, but also because H-Cycle, they had successfully convinced several members that their technology, which was new and sort of innovative and everything, was going to take this extra stuff from landfills, which they said was like waste, and turning it into something useful like hydrogen. And they specifically alluded to this, that it was a green hydrogen, but they never used the actual words green hydrogen. And so they proposed to CalRecycle, the agency of California that covers waste, that they wanted to build 5 sites in California. They haven't built them yet, but they basically want to compete for contracts to get the input for, that's typically used for compost facilities. So if they're approved, they can basically take all of our green waste that we, like our position is we would prefer to go to composting and other actual regenerative practices, and supposedly turn this into hydrogen. So we are very aware of this and are trying to fight this, but it seems to be at the crux of both of this, like this farming issue and the hydrogen investments in California. So really interested to if there was more information on that second meeting somebody mentioned in the California legislature. We'd love to be included on that.
Yeah, thank you. We all would. And you know, I can't tell you how many of our conversations end up being all about hydrogen. It's just amazing. So Christina, we're short on time. Please ask your quick question.
Want me to jump in about the second meeting? So
Yes.
that whole debate is about, it started about AB 1550 and has because Bennett, Assemblymember Bennett, and he would be your contact. It's an invite only, but all it takes is reaching out to Assemblymember Bennett. The date has not been set. He's thinking mid-August. He put out the questions, certain questions he wants to debate, and I'll explain very quickly what those boiled down to after the first session, what industry was proposing. So it started as AB 1550 for those on the call. It was a bill that Bennett introduced after he had some other bills and faced a lot of pushback. One of his bills, for example, was to push hydrogen in other sectors, including light duty, which, you know, we don't have to go, you know, hydrogen's lost that fight. They need to give up on it. So he introduced AB 1550, which he thought would please enviros and EJ people by saying that any hydrogen produced in California must be green. But he put a ridiculous date of 2045. And also it began a huge debate as to what is green hydrogen, right? And so that started, the first meeting was folks coming together, enviros, and enviro and EJ position was pretty much the same. There were 2 versions of their debate of what would be green, without saying they would be pro or against hydrogen. It's just, if you're going to do hydrogen, it needs to do these 3 or 4 things to be green. Right. And the industry presented theirs, which was essentially the status quo. And we definitely need to allow biomass and biogas and dairy and all this other wonderful stuff. And so the next meeting, which has not been set, is for mid to late August. And Bennett is looking for input on what is green hydrogen. So my suggestion would be to reach out to Assemblymember Bennett and inquire regarding this meeting and whether or not you can attend, which I'm sure the answer is yes. He's just, you know, Need to reach
Yeah,
out.
and we've been very involved watching AB 1550. It is, he pulled it at one point and it's now a 2-year bill. So that's what the problem was it didn't have a definition in it. We couldn't believe that.
He pulled it for the purpose of this debate. He committed to both, to both committees, they would have this discussion.
So it's 1 o'clock and I want to thank everybody for being here, but I want to ask Stephen, do you have another 10 minutes if we continue to take a few questions?
I
may
can
not.
probably hang over for a couple minutes, but I have another thing happening now that I should jump
Okay.
forward to.
Well,
Yeah.
we will, I have another meeting too, but we're going to keep this going until we've dealt with most of the questions here.
Yeah.
So next up, Selden, do you have a question for Stephen?
Yeah, I'm just actually going to read one of my Washington State colleagues' question in the chat there. So she's talking about, I believe the Yakima City Council is studying the feasibility of building an anaerobic digester to divert organic material from the landfill, which is close to full. And one of the benefits touted is the potential to create hydrogen fuel for vehicles that cannot be electrified. And so she wants to know, can you direct her to a 1 or 2 pager that she could share with the council to explain to them why we would not want to do that? Thanks.
Oh yeah. I'm trying to think of a 1-pager on bio feedstock hydrogen. I can, yeah, let me try to think about that, because I know there's some about green hydrogen, there's a bunch about blue. Yeah, I don't have one off the top of my head.
Since you have a meeting, if you find something, you could send it to Janet and Janet could get it to me and I can get it to Colleen.
Sure.
Got it.
That's okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Let's see another question in here. Does hydrogen in fuel cells rather than combustion change the calculus with regards to NOx emissions? Do you know that answer, Stephen?
Yeah, it does, because very, very quickly, basically, like when you burn something, right, the NOx comes from oxidizing the nitrogen that's already in the air. It's not because there's anything in the hydrogen itself. It's just that it burns so hot that it oxidizes the nitrogen. With fuel cells, you have an electrochemical reaction, not a combustion reaction, so it doesn't produce NOx. The challenge is just then hydrogen distribution. So like these proposals about like hydrogen filling stations and everything, the NOx isn't the issue, it's the piping hydrogen, leaky explosive hydrogen all around the country that becomes the problem.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So I'm looking through the questions. They're piling on. I think the minute you talk about hydrogen, everybody perks up and asks questions. It's appropriate. So I think most of these things, Beverly asks which vehicles cannot be electrified. Well, I think that what we're talking, it's mostly very large trucks that we're talking about may be appropriate for hydrogen fuel, but that's it. So I think have I missed a question? Is there anyone on here who has another question for Stephen? Otherwise, we're going to let him go back to preparing for his sabbatical, which starts like tomorrow, and wrap this great conversation up. I want to thank you all. We will send a recording of this to everybody and the slides, and I am saving the chat, and I will be back in touch with all of you who have said that you want to continue working with us on some of these issues, both hydrogen and lobbying on the Farm Bill, which is just one of the most important things we can all be doing this year. And we kind of got to hurry, but we're on it. So thank you. It's been a really great conversation, and we'll have more, especially when Stephen gets back from his sabbatical in November, after all the dust is settled on the farm bill. You think? Maybe.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Janet, for inviting me and setting this up. And thanks everyone for your attention and enthusiasm and commitment and interest. And yeah, please, I'm going on sabbatical, but CIEL is still here, and we are absolutely committed to this work and building out this line of work on hydrogen, on ammonia, on fertilizer. So please be in touch. We are here.
And the rest of us will all keep talking. Thank you.
Excellent.
Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.